Today we're going to be making a Winterfell model from the opening sequence of Game of Thrones. We'll start off using two Thingiverse models that are readily available. I really like one part of one and the other part of the other, so we're just going to be taking both of those and putting them together and then printing them out in 3D. There's the first model, there's the second. Since I printed these separately, I have to do a little trimming to make them fit together. So time to mix up some epoxy. While I have the epoxy mixed up, I'll go ahead and use it as filler. I quickly realized there are some parts on the 3D model that just weren't quite right, so I decided I could do a little bit better job. I've taken those two objects and actually merged them together into one file. Then I fixed that one part and decided to add a few more extra details to it. And then I decided I'd add another layer of detail using some laser cut acrylic, but I went ahead and modeled that and then added some more trees to complete the scene. Then I thought, wouldn't it be cool to add some lighting to this? So I modeled some boxes, which I later used as cutters, and cut them out. And of course, it's time to reprint. Printing on PLA Plus using my Raise 3D N2 printer. I can't remember exactly how long this took, but I think it was around 16 hours. Here's the first one. Let's compare it with the second one. Looks better. And you can tell that path detail is missing. I also added some more details up there and then tunneled out all the walkways. And on this other piece, I added some windows so you can see the light shining through. On the first piece, perfectly flat on the bottom, and the second piece has some nice little tunnels for some lights. Here's a quick demo of how it'll work. Time to go ahead and start adding some lighting. I'm using some addressable LEDs, which will later be controlled with a microcontroller. Here's my laser cut acrylic piece. And on the underside, it gives me plenty of room to run my LEDs and wiring. Before I do any kind of painting, I want to go ahead and fill these holes. And to do that, I use some Tamiya putty. This is just regular old modeling putty. And you put it on with a toothpick, your finger, whatever. There's really not a whole lot of cleanup to do though. It printed well. But I do want to touch up some of these places that paint isn't going to fill. take the opportunity to go ahead and sand off any rough edges. And while I have this out, rough up this acrylic piece so that it'll glue to the other part well and also provide something for the primer to stick to. Let's go ahead and mix up some more glue. Fits well. I'm going to use my handy 3D printed clamps, which are also available on Thingiverse. I just added some rubber pads to mine. Here's a little tip for you. Leave your stir stick in the epoxy, and then that way you'll know exactly when it cures. Obviously, it's not quite ready here. I went ahead and printed out some additional trees to put around the base, and once I figured out the placement of that, it's just a matter of doing some trim work and then doing a little bit of sanding. And here we have the final model all glued together and ready to lay down some paint. And to do that, I'm going to use some Tamiya Fine Surface Primer. Here's another little tip. Elevate your model so there's a nice barrier between the paint that gets on your model versus the paint on the cardboard. This is ultimately going to be metallic, so first I want to lay down some black primer, and I'll mix in a little metal medium with that as well. As usual, I'm a fan of putting on several thin coats versus one thick one. Then I went ahead and sprayed on some metallic after that. And here's how it looked. And I was out of regular clear coat, so I just used some adhesion promoter, which is basically just a clear primer. It worked great. Now it's time to put on some paint using just a regular brush. For that, I'll be using Vallejo model colors along with metal medium and or silver to anything I'm mixing up. If you remember the opening sequence of Game of Thrones, then you'll remember the colors are all kind of grungy and dirty. Let's go ahead and put a base coat on this big tree. Using just a liner brush, I'm adding some details, and this paint is very thin down at this point. And now it's time to paint about 100 freaking trees. Next, I'm adding some almost pure silver here to add some highlights, and that'll be a good contrast of the kind of grungy industrial look that the rest of it has. And I'm coming back with kind of a copper or bronze color and doing the same, just touching on a few details here and there, being careful not to overdo it. And I'm looking at some stills from the show to kind of get some reference. Adding the metallic really made a huge difference. Next up, it's time to do some washes. I'm just using the exact same paints, but just watered down. These are acrylics, by the way. And adding a little bit of weathering detail here and there. Make this look a little bit more industrial. Now it's time to add some washes to all those flat areas. And if you remember the show opening, it's really, really filthy. So the best way to do this is do it in multiple passes. And it tends to dry just a little bit lighter than what you're seeing when it goes down. And it's always good to vary the color between washes, so you get a lot of variance in it. Now it's time to put in some lights. I'm going to be using some enamel wire. So it's usually better to use a little bit higher temperature on your soldering iron. I like about 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Make sure your iron tip is always nice and clean. Then put a little bit of solder to tin it. The way I like to use this enamel wire is put a little bead of solder and then melt off the enamel coating, and then it exposes the wire underneath and it's tinned and ready to go. And let's go ahead and cut out some LEDs. I'll be using some liquid flux. You don't really have to use any with these, but it's always a good idea, and it's easy enough with a toothpick or something like that to just easily put a drop where you want it, nice and quick. All you have to do is apply heat to the pad, add a little bit of solder, and just let it flow on there, and you'll have a nice bead ready to solder later. I was going to do this anyway, but went ahead and put down some beads of epoxy to hold down my LED strips. Just seemed like now was easier than later. And there I have everything soldered together. And the other side shows the finished paint job with all those washes. I'll be using a 5-volt Pro Trinket from Adafruit to run these. My code is going to be using HSV versus RGB color values, so I made a little mixer here so I can easily dial in the color and then just see what numbers those are and put them in my code. Once you get the hue dialed in like you want, all you have to do is crank up the value to increase the brightness without changing the color. It's kind of handy. Now it's time to try it out. I uploaded some code and then turned it on, and let's see what happens. Now let's add some additional code to make it randomly flicker, kind of like candle lights. And here's the final model. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe and give me a like. And I will see you next time.